Hello, everyone. Welcome to EMD Media. EMD Media works on understanding, measuring, and doing. And it strives to contribute for a decision based on evidence and evidence-based discourse in the Horn of Africa. Today, we'll be talking about Vadis Horn of Africa, Tigray as a lens. We are live on Facebook and YouTube. Please, those who are following us on YouTube and Facebook, share it, subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet, and like so that many can reach to this material. The way YouTube algorithm works is the more reflections, reactions, it distributes to many people. So please share it on your platforms on WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So we are live with Horn of Africa issues with a focus on Tigray. My guest today is the long-awaited, most awaited guest, Mr. Rashid Abdi. Mr. Rashid Abdi, welcome to MD Media Show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Getachew, and happy to be here. And my apologies also for the mishaps the last few weeks. I have been unwell, but thankfully I am now much better.
Great. It's awesome to have you back. I mean, many follow you and they know you, but we do the usual introduction. So those who just tuned in, my guest today is Rashid Abdi, well known in the Horn of Africa as a political analyst. Those who haven't done yet, he was following on Twitter. There are already 131. Actually, this is a bit old, maybe a week or so old. So it could be more than that right now. So more than 131,000 followers are Abdi analyst. That's the one. We have to pay attention to this because there are many who try to create fake accounts under his name. And so this is the account you see at the bottom on Twitter. He's not active, at least from what I could see on Facebook and other platforms. He's a Twitter analyst. And there is a very interesting connection I saw in terms of how you are affiliated to Sahan and so on. So the way it's defined in the website, it's very relevant to what you do and to what we need to have in terms of pathfinding, navigating. That's what I see. And there is a lot of the understanding and knowledge of terrain, society, environment. Is it a Somali word, right?
Sahan, yes, is a Somali word which means reconnaissance or going out to search for pasture and land for the nomads. In the olden days, nomads used to move from one territory to another, and before the clan or the tribe moved to a different land, they used to send a small team of people who will go and do sahan. They will do scouting and then come back and inform the clan that the land there is perfect so we can move.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm interested in this is the way you try to look at the Horn of Africa and our subject matter, the war on Tigray, Ethiopia. All that is very expert knowledge based of the terrain, the people, the politics, the any kind of complication there. I see a lot in your analysis and so on. So you are associated with that think tank, Horn of Africa political analyst and researcher. We focus on security, migration, stabilization, political and geopolitical developments, and so on. And the way you also write is, you make big points with painting a smile on our faces. So this is from this morning, I guess. You are talking about declaring a unilateral ceasefire. But I mean, there were many who reflected on that. But let's talk about where we are now. So the latest on Tigray, and so on. So what if you were to paint where we are now? Because today we will spend a significant amount of the time on how we understood this before November 4 and where we headed with that. There are a number of things that you said, you warned, boldly where the region is heading and so on. So, but let's start from where we are now. Where are we now in terms of Tigray?
Well, I think, thank you very much. That is an excellent question. There is no doubt that the situation in Tigray continues to develop and evolve I think, in a very extremely unnerving and unsettling way. Obviously, the Tigrayan Defense Forces have achieved significant victory against the ENDF. The ENDF is in disarray. The Prime Minister Abiy has been mobilizing ethnic militias to go back on the offensive. That has not achieved a lot of progress in the last at least 3 to 4 weeks. And this explains why the situation is now progressing in a very dangerous way. The risks of a major escalation is very real. There are reports that the Eritrean military is massing troops on multiple fronts, one on the Adigrat front line, but also another one on the Humera front line. These are two major front lines. And the Eritreans are now beginning to move back into Tigray. And that is a deeply worrying development. Another, I think, significant escalation is the fact that the Prime Minister Abiy went to Turkey, secured a major military agreement with the Turkish government, and there are credible reports that drones and drone components as well as munitions have arrived in Addis in time for a joint combined drive to push back the TDF. Now, on the side of the TDF, I think they have pushed the ENDF and the allied militias out of most parts of Tigray. But on the western parts of Tigray, there are still troops from Eritrea as well as Amhara forces who have occupied that territory. And the significance of that is that is designed to stop the TDF from actually getting a supply route to Sudan. So it is heavily fortified, and the bulk of the firepower of the Eritreans, as well as the ENDF and the Amhara forces, is actually on that front, because that is the only way they can shelter or inoculate Tigray from foreign meddling, as they see it. So that I think is quite significant development. The fact that Eritrea is now becoming deeply involved again in the conflict, and it's also significant that the reports of an Eritrean incursion into Tigray is also coming barely 24 hours after the U.S. State Department basically put the chief of the Eritrean Defense Forces under sanctions. And so this is, I think, the Asmara regime showing its contempt for the US, but also for the international community, to say that we can do pretty much what we want. My fear is that this war is going to escalate, and the potential for really dialogue and resolution through other means are shrinking by the day.
Isn't it? I mean, talking about dialogue, isn't it true that Abiy, behind the scene has been asking for some form of negotiation and so on, whereas in public and in action on the field, like you are mentioning, I mean, Isaias, I don't think he can just jump in and so on without Abiy's permission or asking for that and so on. So what do you see, I mean, from sources and the readings and so on the ground, what are we seeing? Abiy doubling on a number of fronts.
I think I recognize that dilemma, because reading Abiy is actually an extremely difficult and hazardous exercise. But I think from the much we know, he has been pushing very aggressively for a military conquest. And I think there are several reasons why. The first is that, first of all, both the Amhara state and also Eritrea, which form the bulk of Abiy's support base or support structure, are pretty much militant. They are pushing for a very aggressive policy to destroy, dismantle the TPLF and to take over Tigray. That has not happened. They failed. Half of the Ethiopian army basically was put out of action. Hundreds, tens of thousands of troops were killed, and also thousands were taken as prisoners of war. So this is a complete meltdown of the Ethiopian military structure as we know it. And that is why the prime minister is now exclusively reliant either on ethnic militia states from the states, but also on Eritrea. And he wants to prosecute this war largely using these forces. And so he is beholden to these forces. And I think the Asmara government in particular fears basically the prospect of the TPLF asserting full control over Tigray again, because that will mark the end of the Eritrean regime as they see it. I think so far the equation, the military balance of power is really in the favor of the TDF, because there are, of course, reports of a growing military alliance internally within Ethiopia between the TDF and other ethnic forces, the Oromo, for example, Liberation Army. We are also hearing the same among sections of the Afar and other ethnic groups. So there's a real potential for the TDF to actually expand its alliance and to push back against the ENDF. And so from that perspective, it also constitutes a real threat to Abiy's regime survival. And so this is why I think the momentum towards escalation and conflict is there.
Yeah. A very important point there. Yeah. So let's go back in time a bit. Let's say 3 years ago, 2 years ago, you were still a political analyst, so you are following it closely. So this is your an article on the elephant.
Yes.
This is from May 16, 2019.
Right.
Where you talk about a spring in the horn, and what, of course, you are cautiously looking at things in a positive lens, talking about how the prime minister is acting in a positive manner and so on. But of course, you talk about the prospects and so on. So, but then, in time, you just on September 1st, 2020, this is the Prime Minister Abiy has never learned his history and so on. So you are talking about a different prime minister. And so my question is, when did you see Abiy, the character, because this is a big character, like you were saying, Eritrean forces, regional forces from the Amhara region, a number of countries for that matter, increasing now, Turkey coming in, Iran is in, all that and so on. So with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed at the hub, when did you see him for what he is now?
Yes, I think like many analysts and many observers of Ethiopia, but also the Horn, I was impressed actually when Prime Minister Abiy took over power. He moved very swiftly, I think, to dismantle some of the oppressive structures of the previous state. We also saw a remarkable opening up of the, human rights and also free speech and so on. So I think there was huge expectations and hope that this was a prime minister who will fundamentally, I think, change the structure of the Ethiopian state. I think trouble began to emerge towards the second year of Abiy's government, when I think the problem actually started in Oromia, where um, people were beginning to, I think, challenge the prime minister's um, ambition to assert himself as the real Oromo leader. Remember, Abiy was actually a very marginal figure within Oromia. He was a very senior figure. There were other much more bigger names, including Lema Megersa, who was his right hand person. Lemma actually, agreed to step down for Abiy to allow him that space. And so the fact that, there was this Oromo compact or Oromo agreement to allow Abiy to step into this was predicated on the prime minister moving very swiftly to change the socio-economic and political situation in Oromia. But that didn't happen. And I think the discontent in Oromia began to grow, that nothing has fundamentally changed for the Oromo people, despite the fact that Abiy's emergence was actually because of the pressure from the Oromo street. It was this huge mass movement of the Oromo people that eventually led to the crisis in Ethiopia that led Abiy to become prime minister. So there was, I think, a huge discontent in Oromia. And the response by the state was to actually use brute force to crack down. And so there was a lot of killing and a lot of, fighting in many parts of Oromia. And then we saw progressively how that was downhill. He locked up all the key leaders, he marginalized and basically became alone, in terms of, the politics of Oromia. And because he was now feeling isolated from the bulk of Oromia, he now shifted to a much more militant tradition within Ethiopian politics of Amhara nationalism. He embraced Amhara nationalism, who actually also influenced his much more aggressive policies towards Tigray. And so I think this is a prime minister who did not, I think, maneuver this very delicate political crisis through I think, tact, but also through strategic thinking. So I think in many ways Abiy had historic opportunities to fix Ethiopia, but unfortunately, I think quickly in just 2 years of his administration, he completely veered into the opposite. And because he was feeling pressure, he actually began going back to the old tactics of managing discontent. He used brute force, he used military means to crush it, and we saw that crisis actually escalate with Tigray. There was an opportunity for the prime minister to pursue a much more political way of resolving the crisis with Tigray. But I think the by September, at least last year, it was clear that a war was coming between the two parties, between Addis and Mekele, largely because I think the structures of dialogue and conflict resolution had completely broken down. Now, the prime minister could have done a lot of things differently. He could have at least kept the opposition, kept a significant you know structures of liberal democracy still functioning in the country. He could have engaged better and persisted more with Tigray so that there wouldn't be a conflict. And then the most important factor, of course, is that the prime minister has talked a lot about dismantling the federal system. Now, Ethiopia's federal system may not be ideal, and it's not what everyone likes. But on the whole, I think there is genuine support for the ethnic federal model in Ethiopia at the time being. This is not to say that everyone is happy with all aspects of the federal system, but at the same time, to come the way Abiy did and say, I am going to dismantle the ethnic federal system and I'm going to centralize back power and create the old central state. I think that also was a key driver of the conflict, especially between Addis and Mekele. So the prime minister has been good at dismantling, but has been extremely, I think, poor at building. The TPLF, for all its flaws, over the 30 years built a functioning, strong state. It also built one of the fastest growing economies in the Horn of Africa. It built a developmental state that was the envy of many people. It built a diplomatic powerhouse that was respected across the region. But Abiy has completely destroyed that. Today, Ethiopia is largely seen as a pariah state, is a country seen as a country in crisis and decline. And that is, I think, the function of the prime minister's way of administering the country.
You talk about how the Oromo and the Tigrayan self-determination is a very important element in all this, and Abiy was going against that and so on. So, but there is something that people have difficulty to understand. So why Tigray? I mean, specifically when you look at his first year, the first few months, Mekelle was one of the cities where he went to, right? And the kind of support he received there was actually based on polls, which is a rarity in Ethiopia. They don't do polls often. It was higher than even Adama, Gondar, and Bahar Dar in terms of, the positive support for him and so on. So, but then come November 4, 2020, and since then, you can see all kinds of brutalities, atrocities committed on the civilians. And it's not only Abiy. We are seeing, for people like me, unheard of and very difficult to understand still to this day, the elite, the political, the social, the faith elite supporting all this and so on. So did you see this coming? I mean, for those of us who followed your tweets before November 4, you were warning, you're alerting everybody that this is coming. But I'm just wondering, did you see at this scale, with all these forces coming together, with all these brutalities that we saw in terms of mass rape, mass starvation, as we know it now, and so
on? I think no one can really say that they saw what was coming to Ethiopia. I had at least some hope. I knew conflict was coming, but I had hope that this conflict would be probably a time for Ethiopia to reset, to basically, it will be a crisis that offers the Ethiopians the opportunity to sit down and engage more robustly on the future of the country. But quickly we saw actually the way in which the Tigray conflict became quickly regionalized and externalized. And I think the Eritrean factor was probably the most potent, the most dangerous element that was introduced into the conflict in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a vast conflict system, and it isn't very different from other countries. There are multiple conflicts raging, ethnic, territorial disputes all the time. But I think when Eritrea sent troops and began to be part of the ENDF military machinery, I think that completely changed the dynamic. And in many ways, I think Ethiopia is now much more beholden to what Afewerki wants. And I think that is unfortunately the way it is. And it's not just Abiy deciding that he wants to engage in dialogue or to make peace with Ethiopia, with Eritrea, with Tigray, but he has to, at the same time, appease or bring on board Afewerki. And I think that is why this conflict in Tigray has become extremely dangerous, because it now involves a formidable adversary, former adversary of Ethiopia, who has a strategic interest not only in weakening Ethiopia, but also in dismantling and completely destroying Tigray or even annexing it. And that makes the current conflict actually a war unto death, and not a war that will eventually lead to some kind of a settlement. One party must emerge victorious in this conflict, and this is a sad dynamic which is beginning to emerge in this conflict. Yes, there have been horrible atrocities in this conflict, atrocities that have happened in other states in the Horn, especially in South Sudan. We have seen rape used as weapon. We have seen food and starvation used as instruments of war. But I think not on the scale of Tigray. Never before has a state machinery been used on such massive scale to destroy its own people. And I think there is no doubt in my mind that the conflict in Ethiopia is a genocidal conflict, and we should call it for what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I think it has been weeks now for the US to call it, the way it should be called, but they are hesitating. I think it's worth maybe touching on the points of how the international community, the European Union, the Biden administration has been responding to this. But before that, now I just want to, because this is September 4th, you were talking about how Tigray with Puntland and Jubaland as regional states pushing back against decentralization. This is at least 2 months before the war, actually to the day, 2 months before the war, where we were talking about how this could unfold. And then came the election. This is the election that, of course, Abiy is double-tongued, even multiple times. He talks about no war at all. If they want to elect, they can elect, provided that TPLF continues. This is on national TV. He said that there will not be a reason for war and so on. But he went after that and so on. And then you talk about how Ethiopia's importance in the Horn, this again in September, and advising, pushing for dialogue. That's, what is a lot of tweets that reflect on that and so on. So one thing that then on November 4, I think you woke up within some minutes, I guess.
After the offensive, yes.
Exactly. So this is November 3rd. Actually, I was looking at the first tweet you did was very early and so on. So what transpired to that? I mean, because I know there was a speech made by Isaias on July 11, 2018. This is just months after Abiy came to power, where Isaias was speaking at Sawa, and he was talking about political cleansing, the project. And he said that they are working with Abiy and so on. So when we talk about genocide now, is it in the Horn's interest? I mean, specifically in, we have Somalia, Farmajo, and we have Isaias in Asmara and Abiy in Addis and so on. So what do you see brought them together in this project? Because we'll be talking about Somalia's involvement in Tigray as well. So what were you seeing just in the runner-up to November 4 in terms of this tripartite collaboration and so on?
Yes, I think the tripartite alliance, or the alliance between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, was the brainchild initially of Abiy. It was a way of bringing these regional countries into some kind of an economic integration. And he saw that, and he actually, I think, commented or wrote about it and said that the only way you can resolve conflict, especially in a place like the Horn of Africa, is to actually bring states together into some kind of an economic planning. And this isn't new. You know, almost 10 years, 20 years ago, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi had a similar idea. He met Somali clan faction leaders and basically told them that the only way in which Somalia and Ethiopia could resolve its historical differences was economic integration. And he actually talked about ports. So in many ways, that idea was not originally conceived by Abiy. It was conceived by Meles Zenawi, and he was basically taking it to the next level by also inviting Eritrea. But I think progressively, the tripartite alliance became less of an economic integration project and more of a security political project. And the key issue or driver of this was Afewerki. Afewerki asserts a very powerful or dominance over this tripartite alliance. Many of these meetings were held in Asmara, and when Afewerki met with the regional leaders, I think part of the agreement was that there should be mutual security, political cooperation between and military cooperation between the three states. Nothing was initialed in paper, but I think that was the gentlemanly understanding that these three leaders should back each other and should, where necessary, intervene in each other's situation to basically survive together as a group. And I think so progressively from then onwards, there was, in the case of, I think, Abiy, a common desire to dismantle and to basically take on the TPLF. Both Afewerki and Abiy had a strategic imperative to destroy the TPLF. So in the course of time, the key objective of the tripartite alliance became the control of Tigray, the dismantling of the TPLF.
Yeah, on that account, you on November 4, you were talking about how this turned out to be a point of no return for Ethiopia. So this is written with Tobias Hagman, where this you saw what was for me always when I see your tweets, your writings, and so on. You see things for what they are and for what they would be, and so on. So, for example, before the war, you are seeing what came to be later. Then, after the start of the war, you are doubting, you are questioning swift and clean victory. Even after the Prime Minister announced it on November 28, as everyone would remember, after the capture of Magala, he said, now the war is over, so the remaining task would be just for the policemen and women, to pick the criminals' fuse and so on. So, but you are saying no. So, what did you see in Tigray that wouldn't work? Because actually, Abiy is on record saying that Tigray is nothing special about Tigray because he could change the leadership in Somali region. He did that in Oromia. He did that in the Amhara region. So Tigray was meant to be the next one. So, but even after war, after having this interim, administration, that's not working. So what is not working? Why is it not working for Abiy in Tigray?
Yeah, I think anybody who looks at the situation in Ethiopia closely and has followed development at least closely for the last 10 years would know how difficult it is to basically subdue Tigray militarily. And there are a number of factors. As the former, strong party that controlled the state, Tigray had built, a formidable military resources of its own. Many of Ethiopia's top generals who served in peacekeeping missions, but also who served in other conflict hotspots, Somalia, but also South Sudan, were actually Tigrayan. They were from Tigray. So there was, I think, a concentration of some of the best military minds coming from Tigray, but also a formidable military structure that was there, very disciplined force. That was the Tigray state forces. I think after the escalation of the crisis between Mekele and Addis, and also the shift away from Addis to Mekele, there was many of the special forces within the military itself had to relocate to Tigray. So by early last year, it was clear that Tigray had a formidable military machinery, and it was difficult for Abiy to militarily move against it. I think part of the reason why the TPLF decided to make this insurance policy was because they were fearful of precisely this scenario, in which Abiy will not be content to let the TPLF recede into Tigray and build its own state. He will always be fearful that TPLF will connive, will engage in machinations to come back to power. And this was the paranoia that fueled Abiy's disastrous war in Tigray. Despite the fact that there wasn't evidence at all that Tigray or the Tigray People's Liberation Front had any interest of becoming the new rulers of Ethiopia, to displace Abiy. They basically took all these measures in order for their own survival. Now, then there's another, I think, important dynamic, which is that the Tigray People's Liberation Front actually has a long history. Many of its cadres and top leaders were people who fought in decades of guerrilla war, had that ethos and that culture in them. And this is remarkable when you look at some of the footages of people like Sayum Mesfin and some of his colleagues who were killed. If you look at some of their speeches, they are saying, look, if you know our history, you cannot come and expect to subdue us militarily. People should have listened. And that is what it is. This is a very strong, military, strong force, but also has the will to fight, has the morale to fight, but also has that strong tradition of not bowing down. And anybody who looks at that situation would actually have negotiated and not gone to war. But then there's also another factor, which is geography. Tigray is a mountainous region. It's an extremely difficult terrain for a military to operate in, especially a military that is coming from another region. So Tigrayans are fighting in their own homeland. They are defending their own homeland for survival, and they have the history and tradition, basically, to defend their own people. And I think the more military pressure is piled on them, the more they will resist. It's not like the Tigray people and the TPLF and the Tigrayan defense forces are going to collapse because of a military might. And then there's another important factor. A military victory or a military gain must bring political gain. We saw how Abiy tried to create an artificial entity to govern Tigray. There was no support for that structure. In the eventually, those group of people resigned and said, "How can we administer a region where people don't like us?" They didn't even have an office in Mekelle. So that tells to you that you can crush TDF if you want to, but then how are you going to assert yourself politically? What is the end game? What is the political end game? You will basically create pockets of instability. You will create a vacuum, a political vacuum. You will create a huge humanitarian crisis. And that is why I am worried about this conflict. At the moment, we are beginning to see an escalation of the military component. There is a great talk of conquest and military. We will crush TPLF, and there are powerful forces out there who are looking for money, who basically want to sell Ethiopia every technology it wants. But this is not going to lead to peace. It's not going to. Abiy is not going to have an easy time of governing Tigray, even if the combination of Eritrean Ethiopian pressure manages to dislodge the TPLF and the TDF, to destroy the TDF. Managing and governing Tigray will be impossible. And that is why probably the most rational thing for Ethiopia and the best course would be for Ethiopia at the moment to stop military action, to sit down and negotiate honestly to find a settlement, a political settlement.
On the issue of military capability or history and all that you mentioned in Tigray, there is also one thing that happened after the war. The first thing he did was arresting, detaining, even some of them killing over 17,000 members of the ANDF from Tigray. And we know also the UAE drones effectively actually destroyed a significant amount, if not everything, in terms of heavy machineries in Tigray and so on. That's why this swift control of number of areas by ANDF and the Eritrean forces was possible within weeks. Together with that, of course, the TDF avoided any confrontation in the major towns, including Mekelle and so on. So, how did you see? That comeback? Because we started our show with the Eritrean coming back, right? But Eritrea decided to leave Tigray when this major victory for TDF was scored in central Tigray and so on, right? Through Operation Alula. So, are there an analyst, who have been following everything? Did you see that comeback? Coming that fast? Relatively fast, given what happened through the drones, all this massive Eritrean presence, all the way actually to the south Tigray.
I knew that it will be extremely difficult for the Eritrean military, but also Ethiopian military, to degrade or completely dismantle the Tigrayan People's Defense Forces. I knew that this is going to be a messy conflict. It's going to be a grinding stalemate, and will continue to go on for years and years unless there is a negotiated settlement. So my everything I knew from analyzing the Horn for over 30 years tells me that this is not a war that can be declared over in 2 weeks. And the Tigrayan People's Defensive Forces were quickly pushed out of the major urban cities. They retreated back into the mountains, rebuilt themselves, reorganized themselves, then went into counteroffensive. And for an insurgency, an insurgency does not have to defeat the enemy. It just has to delay that victory and put the pressure on the enemy. And that for them is victory. And I think this is why the calculation of Mekelle and the calculation of Addis are completely different. Addis is hoping for a quick victory. He's desperate for a win, in order to show the world that, this massive military investment has finally paid off, because now I can control Mekelle, and, I can control Tigray. But that is not going to happen. And I think for the TPLF, basically to bleed the resolve of Addis, to basically push back against them and say, we will make life miserable and tough for you. This, from a Tigrayan perspective, is victory. And I think they pushed back very hard. But also, as I said earlier, the TPLF has the highest concentration of the best military minds Ethiopia has produced in the last 30 years. And so these people quickly managed to adapt their war tactics to guerrilla warfare, and then they push back very hard. And remember, these generals also know the ENDF. They know the Ethiopian military quite well, and they know their movement, they know their resources, they know their capabilities. And it was easy for them to crush the EPLF, the ENDF. The big problem, of course, has been Eritrea, but also the Eritrean situation is quite complicated. They also come from the same root and branch like the TPLF, very hardened guerrilla military, very strong and very disciplined. At the same time, the key problem is that there is, I think, a different balance here, whereas the Tigrayans are fighting for their own survival, the Eritreans are not fighting for that. The Eritreans are fighting for control. And they are largely fighting for the regime survival of Afewerki. And that means that the morale of the ordinary Eritrean soldier who is now fighting in the battlefronts in Eritrea, in Tigray, is actually very low. Nobody will go to battle just fighting for a big man, who is sitting comfortably somewhere. And this, I think, is the kind of calculation which I think the TPLF and the TDF will manage to eventually exploit in order to win this battle. I have no doubt in my mind that Eritrea and the Ethiopian forces will not manage to subdue the Tigrayan people and the Tigrayan defense forces.
Very important element as well is the fact that the Tigray people, all political actors, military and so on, they saw the war for what it was. So came together because, as you know, Zadkan and a number of, those who are in the command, the central command of the TDF, they were actually not TPLF members for the last 20 plus years. They were kicked out of TPLF, by the late Meles Zenawi and so on. So, but they came together and they are leading the TDF together with other opposition parties who took part in the election in September last year. And the parallel inverse, you talk about parallel inverse in Ethiopia. So one that Prime Minister Abiy and his supporters see victory. And I remember, end of June. So June 28 was the day they left Maqala. And I remember reading a report on reconstructing Tigray. So all the budget, all that is detailed. And the start date of that was July 1st. But they left Tigray, I think 2 days before they were, getting the money to kickstart that reconstruction and so on. So all that talk of reconstruction, everything is okay. I was talking to Professor Tony Maganya, who was in Maqala until January 30th. He's a professor in Maqala University, and he was telling me, live on how he left Maqala, disguised as an Indian and so on. He's an American. And the colonel was telling them, the Ethiopian colonel was telling them, tell anyone who asks you why you are leaving Tigray, just tell them you are leaving for vacation. Tell them, Tigray is all well and, everything is peaceful and so on. So that parallel inverse, I think it continues to this day. And so on. So is there any, where in the past where we can learn from this big scale? It's not only about Tigray. I mean, if people care about the poor Ethiopians who are sending their kids and have no idea what happened to them, this is a national tragedy. But we don't see that reflected in the media. We don't see that reflected in the elite discourse.
Yeah.
What we see is, how Ethiopia is prevailing, how Ethiopia is actually rising, and so on. So, what is the root underlining explanation in your view of this parallel inverse?
Yeah. No, this is a fundamentally, I think, disturbing picture, which anyone who looks at Ethiopia will form. You have a state, a very fundamentally strong state, not well managed over the decades, but still a strong state structure, but then a very divided, very fragmented society, a very weak civil society, incapable of coming together across the ethnic lines and mobilizing to bring about stability and peace. You also have an inability of the ruling elite coming together and in moments of crisis, in moments of real national peril, coming together and agreeing a compact on how to salvage or save the country. Let me just give you an example of where I live, which is Kenya. In 2007 and 2008, there was a huge crisis in Kenya, largely because of a contested election. And this led to ethnic conflict, and over 1,000 people were killed in ethnic, massacres in the Rift Valley. Kenya was actually on the brink of civil war. Immediately, the political elite from the three warring ethnic, ethnicities came together and forged a compact, an agreement to create a national salvation and national unity government. And this ability of the elites in times of crisis to come together to forge a compact does not exist in Ethiopia. We haven't seen in recent years, at least, the ability of Ethiopian elite from across the ethnic divides coming together and saying, this is a serious situation, let's come together for the sake of our nation and agree a roadmap or a deal. Abiy's style or brand of peacemaking is actually war until I subdue Tigray. All the talk about peace and dialogue have been, I think, just rhetoric. Abiy has had multiple African, envoys pleading with him and saying, look, is there anything we can do? Can we mediate in this crisis? Abiy has turned them back. He said, give war a chance. Give war a chance to deliver what? What we see is Ethiopia destroying itself, and in the course also bringing conflict and instability across Ethiopia's borders. Right now, war is intensifying and escalating in Oromia, which is in southern Ethiopia. Kenya borders Oromia and shares a very close ethnic as well as political composition, relations. The Boran on this side of the border share much with the Oromo on the other side of the border. You cannot artificially shelter or put a barrier between the crisis in Ethiopia and the crisis in northern Kenya. Excuse me. And so Abiy's, I think, intransigence and his inability to see the view of the rest of the world is creating a huge problem in Ethiopia. My hope and expectation is at some point, the Ethiopian people from all ethnic divides, at least the elite, will come together and say, how can we find a peaceful path, route to dialogue? Because there is no prospect of this conflict actually leading to any resolution or any I think the Tigrayan people have been put in a very uncomfortable, awkward position in which they have to fight for their own survival, and so you cannot blame them for fighting. Right now there is a siege on Tigray. There's no telephone, there's no communication, internet is cut down, electricity is out, there's no trucks, food coming. Look at the humanitarian. Over 450,000 people need food aid. The World Food Program says you need 100 trucks every day in order to save Tigray. So far, since June, only 350 trucks have gone through. That shows to you the imbalance. The US State Department said there is proof that the Ethiopian government is actually blocking aid, is blocking trucks from entering Tigray. Now there is a siege. A complete siege has been put on Tigray. And then you are talking about ceasefire. You are talking about, making peace. That sounds to me contradictory. It is the parallel world which you are describing.
And despite your call for, ending this war, releasing all political prisoners, this is from December 30th, 2020, and inclusive national conference, all that. There is no sign of going that direction. In fact, what we are seeing in Ethiopia right now is, standing against any power, any leadership, like you were mentioning about the African leaders and so on, but even the US. So, if you see the national TV, the state TV, and the affiliated media and so on, they are actually openly accusing people like Samantha Power as member of or affiliated to TPLF and so on. So the level of absurdity is incredible. How the state, the government is handling all this and so on. But talking about Africa, the African Union, which is seated in Addis Ababa, the first day there was a release that was saying, just end in the. I just want, this one. This is November 3rd. So there was this statement on ending the war, de-escalation, and national dialogue. But ever since then, we didn't see anything. Actually, to the contrary, that Ethiopia is, or the government is doing what it should do in terms of law and order and so on. So, and we haven't seen any significant voice from the African Union, from the Horn, and at large, and so on. So I understand there were some behind-the-scene efforts by other leaders in Africa, but other an analyst who follows all this closely, was your expectation what really happened in terms of the voices of Africa, African Union, and so on, or is it the opposite?
I think I am honestly disappointed by the way the African Union has conducted itself throughout the course of this conflict. I expected the African Union to be much more assertive, to actually talk truth to power, to actually be more straightforward with Abiy, but also to talk to all the parties and use all the mechanisms necessary to ensure at least there is a path towards some negotiated settlement. That has not happened, and I think one of the reasons is the African Union is located in Addis Ababa, and that creates its own pressure and its own dynamic. Historically, because of the fact that Africa is, the African Union is headquartered in a host. It's very un-African to tell your host sometimes the truth, and I think this is the African tradition which is causing problem, that you cannot be truthful with a, if you are living in somebody's, guest house, you cannot then come and lecture that person. So this, I think, unhealthy dynamic also became a bit difficult for Musa Faki to manage. Actually, before even the outbreak of hostilities in November, there was actually a massive, right after the war, actually, there was a massive campaign against the Tigrayans who are serving in many parts of, Addis, including the African Union. And a key, military officer who was Tigrayan was actually removed from the AU at the request of actually the Abiy administration. And that tells to you the amount of pressure that was being exerted on the African Union. So I'm hugely disappointed by the conduct of the African Union, but it didn't come to me as a surprise, knowing the difficulty under which the African Union operates. Is the African Union capable of doing some things now differently? Yes, and I think time is now. There is opportunity now for the African Union to change that policy of, let's not, pressurize Abiy. I think it is the time now to put as much pressure on Abiy, but also the African Union has the I think is basically the continent's premier agency for peace and conflict resolution. It should tell external partners who are now pouring fuel into the conflict in Tigray and who are shipping armaments that this is wrong. And I think the African Union should come out with a strong statement in the coming few days about external partners becoming engaged in this conflict in Ethiopia, because this conflict needs a resolution, not to be inflamed.
And but specific personalities, I mean, we don't see it in public a lot, but like Paul Kagame and so on, they have been pressuring. Maybe they have soured their relationship with Abiy Ahmed, given that out of the 31 embassies that are decided to be closed, I saw Rwanda, the embassy in Rwanda is one of them, and so on. So how much can they put pressure? Now I'm hearing as well negotiation, or some kind of talk. He's preferring over Thabo Mbeki, he's preferring Obasanjo, and so on. So there is also that element that we are seeing between the African leaders, current and previous ones. So do you see personalities like Paul Kagame can come and pressure in terms of, like you said, ending this the involvement of the external parties and making this even worse than it's already?
Yeah, I think Abiy has been, excuse me, Abiy has been extremely adamant that he does not want external mediation. He says we do not need external mediation, and he has consistently maintained that line. At the same time, I think there is growing frustration, both among Ethiopia's closest neighbors. The Sudanese prime minister attempted twice, I think 3 times, to basically tell Abiy that, look, you need to change your strategy. Now, the prime minister of Sudan, Abdallah Hamdok, lived in Addis Ababa for years. This is a man who knows the country extremely well, and actually who loves the country. I know the prime minister extremely well, and I think he is very fond of Ethiopia. Wants to see Ethiopia, thrive and remain united and strong. Nobody wants conflict in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's conflict also risks destabilizing northern Kenya. The Kenyan government, I think, signaled, the Kenyan president signaled a few weeks back that he wants to engage in Ethiopia. Every attempt the Kenyans have made has been rebuffed by the prime minister. So the problem is not with actually the Africans not trying. It's actually Addis Ababa not wanting this kind of African help. So sometimes I think it's not just Africa's ineptitude. It's actually a crisis in the way in which Abiy manages the country. And Abiy is not alone. Abiy and generally Ethiopians have been very strong against external influence. This is a country that has not been colonized. There is a very strong, proud tradition of we will resolve our own problems. Foreigners should not meddle. And so I can understand where the Ethiopians are coming from. But for God's sake, this crisis is huge. Ethiopia risks unraveling. And if Ethiopia unravels, the entire Horn of Africa collapses as well. And so this is a time, I think, for every leader of goodwill in Africa to engage and to put pressure on Prime Minister Abiy to accept peace.
But talking about Kenya, isn't it that at the UN, at least from what we saw in the open session of the UN Security Council, they were clear. I know they are not representing only Kenya, I understand that, but they were clear that they were 100% supporting Abiy in what's going on Tigray, contrary to what we would have expected. They in terms of resolution and so on. So my point is Kenya really understanding? I mean, I can see Uganda, Rwanda, and so on, maybe, saying, stop it, this is not the way to go and so on. But is Kenya really doing that, given what the way it's representing the 3 or 4 A's in at the Security Council?
I think the head of state, President Uhuru Kenyatta, gave an interview to the BBC about, if I can recall, 2 weeks ago, probably more, 3 weeks and more. When he was in London recently for a conference, he actually met the BBC, and in a lengthy interview, the president said, we are concerned about what is happening in Ethiopia. We are Ethiopia's neighbors. We are engaged in dialogue with Addis about ways to resolve this. And the president actually made an important statement. He said the only way to resolve this conflict is through dialogue. And I think you may sometimes think that the UN Security Council seat in the UN by Kenya is being used to support Ethiopia, but I think the situation is much more complicated. And I think during the last, especially sitting open meeting, the Kenyans also endorsed some of the statements about humanitarian access, but also the need for a negotiated settlement. So I think the perception that Nairobi is crudely is also behind Abiy's war effort in Tigray is I think misplaced. There is a strong desire to see a negotiated settlement in Nairobi for Tigray.
Okay, great. Maybe let's talk a bit about, before we finish with the final question on international community reflection and so on, the Somalia factor. I mean, I think it was, if I recall right, it was this man, Abdisalam Guled, who first, I think, blew the whistle in terms of Somali soldiers in Tigray, through Eritrea, and so on. But one thing that, Rashid, that caught my attention was how the Somalian parents, they didn't let it go. They were pushing mothers coming out in demonstrations, and I think pushing the parliament as well. And of course, with people like Abdusalam and yourself also talking about this and so on. So we don't see that in Ethiopia. We don't see that in Eritrea, and so on. So can you speak to that and where we are now? I have been trying to talk to Abdisalam as well, but he's waiting for, getting more information and so on. So how this unfolded and where we are now in terms of that.
Thank you, brother Getachew. I think that's an excellent question. There is, I think, Somalia, for all its chaos and crisis, has a very vibrant civil society, are people actually who are very strong on demanding their rights. Unfortunately, I don't see that huge civic spirit in Ethiopia. Partly, it could be a function of ethnic fragmentation, but also because there isn't that history as well of civil protest and people coming together to demand certain things. But I think I don't want to make a very generalized statement, but unless we see the same type of groundswell of people wanting to challenge the power in Addis, the way in which we saw about 5-6 years ago, this massive uprising in Oromia, this massive uprising in Amhara state to demand changes, unless we see that kind of mass movement, the Abiy is not going to change his course. Right now, Abiy is in very solid territory when it comes to public opinion, especially in a very narrow section of the country. And here I'm talking about the center, which is Addis, and also the Amhara support base. These are very stridently pro-war factions. The media and the political elite in Addis Ababa are all pro-war, and I think this is what is giving the illusion that the whole country is behind the prime minister to prosecute this war. Until, as I said, the civil society in Ethiopia regains its voice, regains its unity, and mobilizes around a program of calling for national dialogue, calling for at least a negotiated settlement. I don't think there will be change in Ethiopia.
That's a very important point. I always wonder. Actually, I tweeted at least a couple of times about the Somali parents. Taking the what should be done and so on. Let's talk about the international community. So let's first, maybe I think I want your reflection, given that you have been on the Arab Middle East platforms as well, talking about Tigray conflict and the Horn of Africa. So what enticed or what attracted this many? I mean, from the very beginning, we know UAE was involved, and then now it's Turkey's, turn. Iran. Actually, I read somewhere this is a only conflict where Iran and Israel are, in different ways taking part and so on. So, can you tell us who is who in terms of Tigray conflict? The Middle East and the larger context are supporting Abiy in different ways, either in military ways, in a number of ways. So, what is your reading of what is a magnet?
Yeah.
For example, there are people who say Kenya's. I mean, you have explained that well, but the Safaricom could have played a role in Kenya, just keeping quiet and so on. So what are we reading in other countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, including Turkey? What is bringing them to Ethiopia to side with Abiy and support him despite this genocidal war is visible for everyone to see in terms of the consequences?
I think Abiy is exploiting a very important fear among each and every state. Abiy has portrayed this war as a fight between a legitimate central authority and a rebellious region. And this is a very powerful fear among many African states, but also states everywhere. And so when Abiy goes abroad and sells the war in Tigray as essentially a fight between a legitimate central authority and an illegitimate rebel authority, then I think he changes the mindset and the perception. Then Abiy exploits also another important factor, which is Ethiopia is the Horn's largest, largest states in the Horn, the most populous state in the Horn with 100 million plus, potentially the biggest market, abundant with water, anchor state, strong military historically. So a very strategic country in the Horn of Africa, the most strategic region in the Horn of in the whole of Africa, because it straddles a major sea lane through which the world's energy traffic and so on passes through. So, from a purely strategic perspective, every country wants a stake, wants to influence events in Ethiopia. And I think in the power balance, many of the external parties are reading the power balance as tilted in favor of Abiy. So they are banking on actually Abiy prevailing and winning in this conflict. And that explains why the Turks and other actors are putting resources. But we must be careful in not generalizing and say everybody is throwing weaponry and helping Abiy. I think there is no very strong evidence, especially about other actors, especially Israel and others in this conflict. And I will just caution against a very blanket generalization. Yes, in the case of Turkey, there is proof that there is first of all an agreement, and last night there was a shipment of arms sent. So I will just urge Tigrayan activists to be also more precise and to also not mimic their opponents and their adversaries who tend to generalize and throw accusations. But yes, there are I think bad external actors who are cashing in on the crisis in Tigray by wanting to make money, but also who are banking on the false hope that Abiy is going to prevail, and therefore this is an insurance policy for them to build strategic influence in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know I can pick your brain for another 5 hours, but you have to go. I understand. So my last question would be, you can make it brief. I don't want to keep you longer than I should. So how do you see things playing out vis-a-vis how the Biden administration, the European Union have been responding to this? And specifically, what kind of leverage do they see? And you can also tie it in terms of how TDF's conditions they have put up a couple of times, and how that is seen internationally, and how you see, given your experience and your analytical tools and so on.
Yeah. I think let me first of all say that the conditions for ceasefire, which was outlined by the TDF, are very pragmatic, are actually very reasonable conditions. And one of the key conditions, of course, is the lifting of the siege. And we hear this repeated all the time by the senior leadership of the Tigray government. You cannot talk about a sincere, genuine dialogue or ceasefire when you are imposing a siege. And there is no way in which the Tigrayans can actually break the siege unless they also extend their military action beyond their borders, in order to break the siege. So it is just logical to assume that if you need peace and to resolve a conflict, you need a sequence of events. You need to first of all lift the siege. Once the siege is lifted, it has to be verifiable. You need a pull out of the troops, of external troops. People should go back to their pre-war borders, and then once that is done, there is I think ground and context for a negotiated settlement. But to just issue a unilateral ceasefire without giving concessions on any other point, I think is meaningless. It's also dishonest. The world the world has taken a long time to react to the crisis in Tigray, and this is unfortunate. The Europeans, did begin from early on, I think, to engage on the issue of Tigray. Also cut budgetary support to the government, which was a strong signal of displeasure. The Americans took a longer time, but I think since the Biden administration came into office, we have seen a quick, remarkable, I think, steps taken to put pressure on Abiy. Yet, I think the reality is that Ethiopia is still what it was. Many people regard it with deference as a strong Horn of Africa state. We should not be bullied. We should not be, sanctioned. And this is what Abiy is exploiting to continue his bad behavior in Tigray. But on the whole, I think the more this conflict continues, the greater the international pressure and the greater the prospect of actually Abiy and Afewerki ending up at the ICC as war criminals. If I were advising them, I'll probably tell them that the best thing you can do for yourselves is actually to negotiate and to make peace now.
Great. Actually, there are so many people commenting and, even forwarding questions, asking, can you ask him about this and that? So we don't have time for that. Hopefully,
I will definitely come back for another session.
please, that would be great. And I'm glad if we can do that and soon, because this is developing and we need your insight. But for today, thank you so much for giving us this very insightful, very well-grounded analysis on what has led to November 4 and how it's playing out and how it might play out in the coming weeks and months. Thank you, Rashid, for your time for today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, sir.
You have been following us live on YouTube and Facebook with Rashid Abdi, a well-known, famous political analyst on the Horn. He gave us his insightful analysis on the war on Tigray in the context of the Horn of Africa. So that ends today's show. ከመጨረሳችን በፊት ግን የነገ የፕሮግራም ማስታወቂያ አረጋለሁኝ። ነገ በአማርኛ ከዶክተር ጸጋይ አራርሳ ጋራ እንገኛለን ላይቭ ከ10 AM Eastern Time 10 AM Eastern Time live Vadis Ethiopia and its constitution በአብዛኛው ከኢትዮጵያ ህገ መንግስት የትግራይና የኦሮሚያን የሆነ ያለውን አይተን Vadis እንላለን ማለት ነው። ለብዙዎች እንዲዳረስ ሼር አድርጉ ላይክ አድርጉ የኤምዲ ሚዲያ የተለያዩ እንግዶችን በተለያየ ጊዜ ያመጣል በእንግሊዝኛ በአማርኛ በትግርኛ ይሰራል ለመረዳት ለመለካት እንዲሁም ለመከወን እንዲመች ለመረጃ ጠገብ ለማስረጃ መር ተዋጽኦና ውሳኔ የራሱን ትንሽ አስተዋጽኦ ለማድረግ የሚታትር ሚዲያ ነው ሰፖርት አድርጉን ሰብስክራይብ አድርጉ ለዛሬው ይሄን ይመስል ነበር መልካም ቀን